we saw just fairly recently that Donald Trump uh, signed into um, well, not law exactly, but he signed an executive order regarding criminal justice reform. And this is one of those stories where you kind of wonder where the reporters are coming from. It says it's a scoop, which means that it's essentially, it doesn't say who in the White House is saying this. There's a lot of unnamed sources, and I was trying to find out because Axios, I don't know if you're familiar with them as a news organization, but they usually play it pretty straight. They're not far left. They're certainly not far right. It seems like they're just trying to be like the AP or Reuters, just just reporting the news. Um, but when I looked into who runs the website, all the founders come from Politico. They all have left leaning alliances. But regardless, what I thought was interesting was they have and the White House. And a lot of people, believe that Jared has a great deal of influence in the White House. He certainly seems to. They gave him a lot of responsibility that we talked about last week with regards to the Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they're saying here, and I'd heard that Ivanka was involved, so I guess it makes sense that Jared would be involved in this one as well. That he was the one who pushed for criminal justice reform a few years ago, and that well, there's some alleged strong language from the president, basically calling him woke, calling him a lefty, and that's sort of the divide that they're trying to set up here. That these reporters are trying to set up here. What do you think? How credible do you think this is, Eric?
Well, I think Trump has a really interesting record on criminal justice reform. I actually did a micro episode myself a couple weeks ago when Trump's executive order first came out. I was taking a look at it, what it actually said.
Right.
And it's interesting because it dealt with one of the major issues that people have been talking about and say that they want, and that's important, which is specifically certification, uh, different, sort of more, I guess, nationalized certification standards, which I don't know how I feel about that. And then also information sharing, which I think almost has universal backing. That's the idea that if you kind of screw up in one department, you're not going to be able to hide in another one because they don't realize they don't realize what you did. So
Hmm.
you want to keep like a national database, especially for things like use of force incidents. If you have a use of force complaint, they want that complaint to travel with you if you apply to a different agency. I think that's very reasonable. Very, very
Hmm.
reasonable. So that's one of the things that the executive order addressed. But of course, prior to all this, people famously remember Kanye West, going to the White House. The entire reason that Kanye West was going to the White House was because his wife is a big advocate of criminal justice reform, and that's something that they were trying to address with Donald Trump. And as far as I could see, Donald Trump seemed very favorable to the idea of things like changing sentencing guidelines, maybe loosening things like the three strikes and you're out standard. Which, by the way, these things all come from the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was the one that backed these things and started these things in the first place. And a lot of people have been talking about this because we have a huge prison population, largest prison population per capita, I believe, in the world, even in excess of China. When you're talking per capita, so we have mass incarceration, and that's something that I think a lot of us, especially on the Liberty side, are concerned about. And Trump has been very sympathetic, I think, towards that issue. And in terms of advocating that, yeah, we do need some reform on this issue. So I think Trump has a really interesting record when it comes to criminal justice reform. And, I've made the argument many times, especially in my personal life, and I've said it on the program at least once. I don't necessarily regard Trump as a quote unquote conservative. So I think he is more receptive to some of these ideas than say your quote unquote typical Republican.
Yeah, you brought up some good points. First of all, he does seem to have a close relationship with Rand Paul. Rand Paul has been a big supporter of his, even when they don't disagree. He's always expressed his disagreements very respectfully of the president, and seems to be able to work with him um, in a way that other senators other politicians in general have not been able to do. So that makes me a little suspicious, because this was one of Rand Paul's issues. And so the idea that he would just turn on not just Jared, but in sort of implicitly turn on Rand Paul, just, I don't know, something about that doesn't quite ring true. They're very close. And the other thing that you mentioned was the executive order. So the timing of this, I don't see how the timeline really makes sense on this. That he was in favor of criminal justice reform, or at least Jared made him do it, allegedly. Okay, according to this article. And then uh, the George Floyd incident happens. You have unrest, you have protests, you have riots, and so you think, okay, that's going to be the thing that turns him against criminal justice reform. But then he goes ahead after that and signs an executive order that goes further than the law. I mean, not that it violates the law, but it's in addition to, it augments the law. I guess you would say. Um, so yeah, this normally I think Axios's reporting is very solid, but something about this, it seems like it's well, first of all, the fact that it's anonymous sources, which means that if it is false, um, they're not as worried about blowback, at least not publicly, unless they're outed later for having fed false information to a reporter. And I don't see that happening. So yeah, this will be interesting to see if we hear about this again, but we might not. This may be just fake news that's out there. But I thought it was at least interesting
Well, I
because
will
it's a very complex
one
dynamic.
other scenario, Pete. I do want to give one other scenario,
Okay.
which on the last program we talked about John Bolton, and this
Hmm.
might be the Boltonization of justice reform for Trump, very much like his foreign policy. Remember, Trump campaigned on a non-interventionist foreign policy, and he said he wanted to get the troops out of Afghanistan, and then it didn't happen because basically his advisor said that was a terrible idea, and then he backed away from that. We know that he got into multiple conflicts with John Bolton over a lot of different security issues, and we also know that John Bolton came very much from that establishment crowd of Republicans that quite frankly are hawks, from that sort of hawk section of the party, which is very traditional within the Republican Party. There's that section is there. It's been there for a long time. Likewise, there is a section of the Republican Party that is, very pro law and order, very pro police. Trump himself is very pro police. He's a very pro police individual. But I can see sort of, if I don't know what other way to call it, sort of the deep state of the Republican Party, if they kind of are saying, hey, you've gone too far, and we need to reverse direction here. I don't know who else besides, say, Rand Paul. Rand Paul's a good example. I don't know who else is whispering in Trump's ear in the other direction if somebody comes to him like that. You know what I mean? If there's a significant block of sort of connected people and advisors who say, hey, you're too soft on this. This is not going to work well. It's not going to play well. Whatever they're saying to him, I kind of wonder who's on the other side that would kind of bring him back and say, no, you've been doing good on this. We just need to keep going in that direction.
Yeah, well, Rand Paul and Mike Lee obviously are in favor of criminal justice reform, and you're right. It's hard to say who would be against it, and there's really no tension here. Just like there's no tension between having an America First foreign policy and saying that we need to be involved in fewer wars. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but it can be something of a balancing act. How do you balance those competing interests? Um, and so, law and order versus criminal justice reform. If you think of criminal justice reform as being anti-police, which is, I think, a mistake, because that shouldn't be ever the goal should never be to undermine the police or undermine the rule of law. It should be to uphold the rule of law by making sure that everybody is accountable, that the law is applied fairly to police officers, and so making sure that the records follow them. That's kind of in that vein. That doesn't undermine the rule of law at all. It's just about accountability. So yeah, this my gut tells me this might be fake news, just because it's talking about what is ultimately a false conflict.
That very well could be the case. It certainly wouldn't be the first time.